All right, so lesson 4 is dealing with configuring Webex hybrid message service. This is a relatively new hybrid service through the Webex solution, so you may or may not be familiar with this one. Our objectives for this lesson are going to be to first cover deployment requirements and then expressway requirements. We'll talk about certificates, call manager requirements, IAM and presence requirements, final steps, and then look at some different deployment models. So let's go ahead and begin with the deployment requirements. First, we want to define what is hybrid message service. Now, Cisco's been playing around with the naming a little bit. You'll hear me call it Jabber hybrid message service. You'll hear me call it just hybrid message service. It's all the same thing, right? So hybrid message service involves an on-premises deployment of Cisco Jabber, integrating with a cloud deployment of Webex Teams. Like any other hybrid integration, there is a connector card in the Webex Control Hub where you will actually initially start setting up this integration. And then once the hybrid message service integration has been configured, then the Jabber client can engage in chat messaging with Webex Teams applications. This is just for, or it's really intended for one-on-one chat messaging. I believe they've now added the ability to do some group chat messaging in there. I can't remember if that has come out already or it's about to come out. I hear stuff all the time that is projection in the future, and sometimes I get confused on what's actually released and what's not. And with Webex also, Cisco has a tendency to update things a lot quicker because it's cloud-based than they do with, say, an on-premise update, for example. So where CUCM gets a major upgrade, usually once every year to a year and a half, sometimes as much as 2 years. Webex is different because they can just upgrade the cloud and everybody gets that update automatically. So with the cloud, they're doing at minimum 4 major upgrades a year, which is very different than what we're used to with an on-premise solution. So sometimes it's hard to keep track of what's coming down the pipe and what's already been released. But I believe as of right now, Webex does support, hybrid message service does support both one-on-one chat messaging with this solution and group chat messaging. So what services are available in a hybrid cloud deployment using the hybrid message service? You have the Webex messenger contacts, which is because you're doing the Active Directory integration, which we talked about yesterday. If you're doing an AD integration on the CUCM2, then the contacts should be the same. So being able to look up users, whether they're on Jabber or on Webex Teams, shouldn't matter. They should be able to look each other up within their contacts. The Webex Messenger service also allows users to be able to publish their presence availability and subscribe to other users' presence availability. In other words, whether they're a Webex user or a Jabber on-prem user, they should be able to see the present status of one another. Now remember, I did mention this the other day, that when you're using the hybrid message service, there's a delay in the present status being shared across these different solutions. And you'll see why in a little bit. I'll return back to this and talk about it again because there's so many different server components involved with sharing that communication. And there's different protocols being used that have to be converted over so that these systems can talk to each other. There's a lot going on. And so present status usually shares a little bit slower. You can expect a minimum of a 10-minute delay when the present status changes on a user's device, whether it be Jabber or Webex, when they're sharing across the different solutions. So if a Jabber user changes their present status, other Jabber users will see that instantly, but a Webex Teams user won't see that for at least 10 minutes. And same thing's true the other way. If a WebEx user changes their present status, then other WebEx users are going to see that change immediately, but Jabber users are not going to see it for at least 10 minutes. But they can share present status, so that's kind of an important element here. Then third, the WebEx Messenger service allows users to send and receive. Oh, I'm sorry, I did the wrong one. That's not supposed to be conferencing. This is actually two of them right here. It's not just presence, it's also instant messaging. So the third one is WebEx Messenger service allows users to send and receive instant messages between Jabber and WebEx teams. This is a little bit more instantaneous. It's not a 10-minute wait. You might have to wait a few seconds, but when I post an instant message, it'll show up almost immediately on the other user's application. So going Jabber to WebEx or WebEx to Jabber, it's a little bit quicker. So you can share contacts, you can share instant messaging, you can share presence. Those are the three benefits to setting up a hybrid message service. Now, in addition to that, let's talk about the conferencing piece. Audio calling, video calling, conferencing, voicemail services, these are all available and will continue to operate through the CUCM just as they always have in the past. That's not an added service of hybrid messaging service. That's a service of WebEx that you can already set up and integrate with your CUCM. And there's different ways to do that, some of which we've already talked about, some of which we're going to continue to talk about moving forward with some of the other hybrid integrations and so forth. But that's just another piece of WebEx that is also usable in this type of deployment. Again, whether you set up hybrid message service or not, conferencing is an available option, but what you get in addition to that with hybrid message service is between your on-prem Jabber clients and your cloud WebEx Teams clients, you get presence, you get instant messaging, and you get contact sharing. All right. All right, so this diagram shows the progression of your user population as you implement hybrid message service. Now, what we assume, we're going to kind of walk through a general overview of the entire setup of this solution. What we're assuming at the beginning is that all users within your organization are using Jabber on premise for all of their instant messaging between one another. And we're also assuming, because this is an on-premise deployment, that the end users that we created within our environment were imported from Active Directory. That's kind of an important assumption here. If these were manually created users, it does change a lot of the behavior of how all of this is set up and how you continue forward with it. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it does change the whole dynamic of this solution. So part of the, I don't know, the gasoline that makes it run, I guess you could say, is that you need an Active Directory integration for your users on-prem, because when you're setting up WebEx in the cloud, you're going to want to do an AD integration there so that you have the same users imported within both solutions. All right. So we are making some assumptions here. One, that all users are using Jabber on-prem at the beginning of this setup, and two, that those users were created in your CUCM and IAM Present server using an Active Directory integration. All right. Then the next step is to order your WebEx solution and implement it through the WebEx Control Hub. We're just talking about the initial setup. A customer who's using Jabber on-prem, they decide we want to use the cloud for some of these services as well. So what they're going to do is order through their partner the WebEx solution, and then they log into the WebEx Control Hub and begin to set up the organization. This is things like verifying your domain, right? Making sure there's an administrator in WebEx established. Some of these basic settings like that. Then, once that's set up, then you need to sync your users into WebEx through the Active Directory integration. This is everything I illustrated to you yesterday when we talked about the directory integration on how to import your users, right? That's what we're talking about here. And so you go in, you download the directory connector, set up all your settings to decide what users you're going to import them in, verify that they've been added into the Webex solution. So none of this is hybrid messaging service implementation, right? These are just your prerequisite settings that must be configured up and be configured in any type of Webex deployment. It's not specific to hybrid message service, but again, you can't set up hybrid message service or shouldn't set up hybrid message service without doing these things first. All right. Now let's get into the real kind of meat and potatoes of it here. The next task that must be performed is to enable the hybrid message service for some of your users. You do not have to enable the service for all of your users, right? You just have to enable it for some, because when you're setting this up initially, you're just going to test it out. You're going to see how it works. You're going to identify some people within your organization who are your early adopters, and they're the ones you're going to enable the service for. All right. Now, on the right side of the screen, what we see here is without setting this up, because we have on the previous slide, let's go back. On this previous slide, we have first just our Jabber users. Oh, golly, my pointer's going all over the place. We have just your Jabber users here. Then we set up Webex Control Hub. Now we have Jabber users and Webex Teams users. So Webex Teams can message Webex Teams, Jabber can message Jabber, and that's it. Same thing we have on the other side. On the next slide here, Jabber can message Jabber, Teams can message Teams, but they cannot communicate with one another yet. So we go in, we select the hybrid message service card, we go through the steps to set this up, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. And then once it's set up, we identify, here's our early adopter users, and I'm going to make these people right here active for hybrid message service. Now, what does that mean? Once the service has been set up for those users, there's 4 different ways messages can be sent. The user can, without message service, can use Webex Teams. A user without message service can use Cisco Jabber. That's what you see on the left side of this circle, right? These 2 users have not been set up for hybrid message service, but they can still send messages. Then you have a user with a message that does have the message service enabled, who can use Webex Teams right here in the top right corner of that circle, and the user who has been enabled for hybrid message service can send messages using Jabber. So these are your 4 different types of users that can send messages. The arrows that you see here are the behaviors that you can expect when they send messages. So just like without hybrid message service, Webex Teams can send messages to Webex Teams. Jabber can send messages to Jabber. So if the service is enabled, you expect that behavior to continue, right? Webex Teams can send it to Webex Teams. Jabber can send it to Jabber, right? But what you also get is now Jabber can send messages to Webex Teams, hence the up arrow, and Webex Teams can send messages to Jabber. There's your down arrow, right? Webex Teams, and this is for those who have it enabled. But even if they don't have the service enabled, Webex Teams can send messages to Jabber that's not enabled for the service, and Jabber not enabled the service can send messages to Webex Teams that is enabled for the service, right? Where it's going to fail is when Webex Teams users who do not have the service enabled try to message with Jabber users who do not have the service enabled, or vice versa. They will not be able to message each other. That's kind of obvious one. The one you don't expect, though, is a Jabber user who is enabled for hybrid message service can send messages to a Webex Teams user who's not enabled, but notice this is a one-way arrow. This Webex Teams user not enabled cannot send messages back to that Jabber user, even though he's enabled for hybrid message service. And that is a planned behavior. So basically what we're saying here is of these 4 different types of clients that can send messages, there's 16 possible interactions that could happen, right? If you have two-way communication. So this is 2 interactions right here. This is 2 interactions right here, 2 interactions right here, 2 interactions right here, 2 interactions right here, 2 interactions right here. You add it all up, it's 16 interactions, right? 8 possible directions, 16 interactions. Of those 16 interactions, there's 3 directions of messages being sent that you expect to fail. All right, so what's the expected behavior between your messaging clients? So we have 4 different types of clients here that can send messages. We have Jabber clients, which are enabled for hybrid message service. We have Webex Teams clients, which are enabled for hybrid message service. We have Jabber clients not enabled for hybrid message service, and Webex Teams clients not enabled for hybrid message service. Out of these 4 different types of clients that can send or receive messages, there are 16 possible interactions that could occur between these clients. We just say possible interactions because this is a direction they will try to send a message. All right. Now, some of these we absolutely expect to work. So, for example, we expect Webex Teams users to be able to send messages to other Webex Teams users whether or not they have hybrid message service enabled, right? We also expect Jabber users to send messages to other Jabber users whether or not they have hybrid message service enabled. That shouldn't matter, right? That should always work. And it should work in either direction, right? This is where we start seeing some of the issues, though. If a Webex Teams user not enabled for hybrid message service sends a message to a Jabber user not enabled for hybrid message service, that communication will fail. But here's the thing, on your client, you will not see a fail message. It'll say it sent the message. It never tells you it didn't send. It's just the receiving client doesn't receive the message. And so you have to understand what's going to work and what's not, or people are going to be wondering, why I sent you a message? Well, I didn't get it. Well, why not? I don't know. Well, here's why. Right? If you send it from a Webex Teams client that's not enabled for hybrid message service to a Jabber client not enabled for hybrid message service, the message will not be sent. Same thing is true in the other direction. If a Jabber client not enabled for hybrid message service sends or tries to send a message to a Webex Teams user not enabled for hybrid message service, that interaction will fail also. Now, what if a Jabber client tries not enabled for hybrid message service, tries to send a message to a let me say that again. If a Webex Teams client not enabled for hybrid message service tries to send a message to a Jabber client that is enabled for hybrid message service, that interaction will fail also. And this behavior is expected. Cisco designed this service in this particular way to reduce load because they anticipate that you will enable hybrid message service for your early adopters in your organization, and that those early adopters will use Webex Teams clients as their primary chat client. So the expectation from Cisco is that if a user is using Webex Teams, then they have hybrid message service enabled. So this type of communication probably would not even work, right? So by design, this interaction will not work. So if you have Webex Teams users, make sure they're enabled for hybrid message service. That's the moral to the story, right? What happens in the other direction, though? What if a Jabber client right here, who's not enabled for hybrid message service, tries to communicate with a Webex Teams client who is enabled? It's the opposite behavior, right? That one will work. And the reason for that is we don't expect our early adopters to be Jabber clients, we expect them to be Webex Teams clients. So we expect, you notice the little asterisk or star right here beside this user, we expect the Webex Teams user to be enabled. We do not expect the Jabber client to be enabled for this service. Therefore, this communication will still work. And so it gets the green check mark, right? So these are the 3 communication attempts that are expected to fail. Everything else should work. So whether or not the Jabber client is enabled or not for Webex Teams, if the message is sent from a Jabber client or Webex Teams user who is enabled, the recipient will receive the communication. So Jabber enabled for the service obviously can communicate with Jabber. Teams obviously can communicate with Teams if they're enabled for the service. But also Jabber sending a message when Jabber's enabled for the service, whether Teams is enabled or not, they will, receive the message. And same thing's true if Teams is enabled for the service, whoever they send it to, whether they're enabled or not, that recipient will also receive the message. So that behavior is expected, it will work. Okay? So hopefully this helps clarify that a little bit for you. Very important to understand the communication behaviors in certain directions. So to enable hybrid message service, you must use the supported Cisco present software listed in this table right here. The Cisco Business Edition has a CUCM and IM and Present server as part of its package. So make sure you're using the right version. You must also be licensed to use Cisco Webex. So you can create your organization using the Webex Control Hub. You can't use the Webex Control Hub unless you're licensed to do so. You need to use the following systems to deploy and manage your hybrid message service. And these are more generally required when you deploy Webex Teams and hybrid services, not only for hybrid messaging service, right? You must deploy the Expressway C connector host for this type of connector to work. Organizations using the hosted collaboration solution do not need the Expressway on-premise, on their own premises, because they can use the one in the cloud. Instead, their hosted collaboration solution partner deploys that as part of their cloud service offering. So let's look at what the Expressway requirements are. You can use this checklist to prepare an Expressway C for Webex hybrid services. Before you register it to Webex Cloud, the host hybrid service connector software must be installed. Cisco recommends Expressway C be dedicated to hosting connectors. We've talked about that yesterday. You can use the Expressway C for other purposes, but again, it's going to change the number of users you can support because of resources available on those servers. So the steps that you must follow in order to set up your Expressway C. You want to make sure you have full administrative rights in the Expressway and that you have the login credentials necessary to go in and do everything. Then you want to log in to the Webex Control Hub and deploy the Expressway C connector host in a cluster account for redundancy. If it's always better to do a cluster if you can, but make sure that's deployed also. And then the requirements for Expressway C include installing the minimum supported software version, install your OVA file on the server. The OVA file contains your ISO files too, so building the VMs for Expressways are really easy. If it's your first time running the Expressway, there is a first time setup wizard that will pop up and walk you through how to configure all your basic network settings. Check that all your network requirements are met for your Expressway C connector host, and then configure the Expressway C at least as a cluster of 1 If you're not planning to put multiple nodes in the cluster, you just want to set it up as a cluster of one. You want to make sure you have obtained the details of your HTTP proxy server if you use a proxy server for internet access. And then if you are using a proxy server, there's two types of proxy services Cisco has tested and verified that work with this solution. You can use Squid version 3.1.19 on or Ubuntu 12.04.5. Cisco has not tested any other services. It doesn't mean they won't work. It just means they haven't tested it. It does not mean they won't support it either. It just means they may not have information to help support that service. So those are the ones that Cisco recommends. You want to identify how you want to perform your certificate trust. Remember we talked about this yesterday when you're using connector hosts. You can let the Webex Control Hub manage your certificates, or you can manage them manually. So you want to decide that prior to setting all this up so you can go ahead and begin to set up your certificate trust if you decide to do that manually. So once you've installed and set up your Expressway C connector host, do not try to initiate the connectors from the Expressway C. At this point, you want to go over to your Webex Control Hub and begin the installation there. Cisco Webex hybrid services use software connectors hosted on Expressway C in order to securely connect Webex to your organization environment. So the steps you want to follow to set this up is from the Webex Control Hub. You want to go to the Services menu in the left column, and then you'll see what you see in this first square right here. It says Hybrid Message. This is called a card, and you'll have a whole bunch of different cards in there. Some of them are hybrid cards, some of them are not. So you want to go and find the Hybrid Message card, and then click Set Up. And if you've registered connector host before using Expressway C, then you can just say I'm adding another service here, or you can set it up for the first time like I showed you yesterday. So you can add a resource if you've done other hybrid message services too for different locations. You can add another one in a new location also. You can also run multiple connectors on the same Expressway C connector host. So if you set up the Expressway C connector host for calendar messaging, which we talked about yesterday, you can just turn around and add hybrid messaging to that same service, right? So choose a method to register your Expressway C. It's either going to be a new Expressway or an existing Expressway. Then once you've chosen that and then put in the appropriate information, you want to click Next. And for new registrations, you want to click the link to open your Expressway C. It'll prompt you to sign in, and then it'll load the connector management window. Decide how you want to update the trust list. Again, you can do that manually, or let the Control Hub manage those certificates for you. And then you will watch as the you want to allow access to the Expressway also. If this is your first time doing it, you want to make sure you check the box to allow access to Expressway. That just gives Webex Control Hub permission to download the connectors and all the information related to that. And again, it will not work unless you allow it. So you have to allow access. Then you wait for the connectors to download. This is the managing the certificates you see right here. You want to make sure you check that box and click register, and then you'll see it download. Once it's downloaded, it'll say message connector. It's kind of hard to read, but it's what it says right here. Not configured, and then you can click on the link to start configuring it. Let's let's see. So after the Expressway C registers successfully, the Webex hybrid service window on the Expressway C shows the connector downloading and installing. We talked about a lot of this yesterday, how each connector installs the interface pages that you need to configure and activate the connector. Once it's finished installing, you can go to Applications Hybrid Service menu and access the menus to configure the connector from there, because you'll have new menus added. A little bit about certificates. The table on this slide lists the certificate authorities that your on-premise or existing environment must trust when using the Webex hybrid services. If you opted to have Cisco Webex manage the required certificates, then you don't have to do anything here to manually append a CA certificate to the Expressway C trust list. But I just wanted to include this slide for you so that you have a kind of identifying table that shows you what certificates are required, in case you manually want to manage them yourself. Moving on, there are some call manager requirements as well. All publisher nodes must be running the Axle service. When you set up on the Expressway C connector host, when you start configuring the connector, you'll have to put in the Axle username and password. So Cisco also recommends for high availability deployments that you run Axle service on all nodes in the IAM and presence server clusters as well. And then you need to configure an account for Message Connector to access the Axle API on the CUCM IAM and presence service. You must use an independent administrator account, not the main administrator account. So make sure you're creating a separate account for this service specifically. Remember that the details of the account, so that when you're setting up the message connector, you can enter those credentials in there. So if you want to know how to configure an administrator account on the CUCM or an application account on the CUCM, you just go to the user management menu and select application user, and then you can click add new and give them the appropriate permissions. Make sure that they are configured with the standard Axle API access role, and then click save, and that's all you have to do there. So username, password, give them the Axle API role, save it. That's all you have to do. Real simple. Not a lot of IAM and presence requirements, but there are a few. If you have multiple IAM and presence servers within a cluster, you must have the inter-cluster sync agent working across all nodes within the cluster. If any of your IAM and presence server clusters have been upgraded from an earlier version than 10.5 Service Pack 2, then you must apply the Cisco options package to the cluster in order to prepare them for the hybrid message service, because there are components that aren't going to be included in their software that are needed that are included in this service pack. So you can just go to software.cisco.com, search for IAM presence server under utils. You see in the left column here, you select that, and then you come down and look for the bash environment variable patch to address CVE file, download this, and then you'll have to go through the install process to add it to your IAM presence server. All right. To enable hybrid message service, you must link message connector in your IAM presence service cluster by entering server information for the publisher node. And this step builds the bridge between IAM presence service and the Cisco Webex Cloud, with the connector acting as a broker between the two. On each Expressway cluster that you use for the hybrid message service, this is just your Expressway C connector hosts. That's the only ones you need to worry about. You want to sign into the primary node and then go to Application, Hybrid Service, Message Service Configuration, click New, enter the IP address or URL of your IAM and Presence publisher node. And this is the one that has the Axel web service enabled. You want to enter the credentials of the message connector Axel account you created in the IAM and Presence server publisher. Again, do not use the default main administrator account. And then optionally, you can change certificate validation to disabled if you want the Expressway to waive the check of server certificates for the publisher node. Not recommended, but it is possible. If the certificate validation is enabled, which is the default setting, then the Tomcat certificate of the IAM and Presence service node must be valid and signed by the CA that the Expressway trusts. So you got to make sure that trust is built there. If you're using self-signed certificates, copy it into the Expressway's trusted CA certificate list, and that should be adequate. Then you click Add to store the connection configuration on the Expressway C. And then if you have multiple Expressways in the cluster, you may need to repeat this step in the other nodes of the cluster. All right, so final steps. You want to manually enable the message connector after you've configured the connector with the IAM and Presence publisher and Axel account information. So from your Expressway C, you can go to Applications, Hybrid Service Connector Management, and then click the message connector. Choose Enabled from the active drop-down list, and then click Save. The connector starts and the status changes to running on the connector management window. So this is kind of like with the counter connector we talked about yesterday. Once you get it set up, you have to enable the service. Verify the message does display as running. And then you can go into the Webex Control Hub and enable the service for your users. All right. So that's going to be your next step here. From the Webex Control Hub, what you want to do is go to the Users menu, choose a user from the list, and when the flyout windows opens on the right, you want to click Edit, and ensure that the user's assigned at least one paid service under License Collaboration Services. Then you want to click on the message service, toggle the setting to on, and then save your changes. That's it. It's really easy to set them up for the service. Now, let me say that I have set this up before, and once I turn on that service, it takes a little bit, can't talk today. It takes a little while before it will show as available or active. But even though it shows available or active, does not mean it is truly active, because there are still things going on the back end. And I've seen this take anywhere from 5 minutes up to over an hour to activate the service. Usually this one's a little bit quicker than the next one we're going to talk about, the Jabber messaging mode. But it does take a little while sometimes for this to activate. So you just have to be patient with it. If you set it all up and it's not working, it doesn't mean you did something wrong. It just means the system's busy on the back end and needs to do some more stuff. So wait an hour, maybe even a little bit more than an hour if you have to, and then test it. If it still doesn't work, then you want to start troubleshooting. But if you go in thinking you configured something wrong, you start changing settings, before it ever gets set up, you could end up breaking the system. And so I think it's important when you're troubleshooting Webex solutions, especially from the perspective when you first enable it, you just have to be patient with these systems. It takes time on the back end for these services to enable and set up. So patience is key when it comes to troubleshooting. Something to keep in mind. All right, there are a couple deployment models we want to talk about. You do want to consider the following factors when choosing how to deploy hybrid message service. First of all, you want to examine the scale. How many IM and present service users do you expect to be able to use the service? Because you may need to add nodes, clusters to improve the capacity of the service in order to meet that requirement. Cisco does support up to 5,000 message service users per small expressway and up to 6,500 users per medium expressway. We're talking about small expressway and medium expressway. It has to do with the virtual machine size. When you're building your VM through the OVA, you can choose small, medium, or large, right? And so depending on what server size you choose, these are the numbers of users it can support. So for a small server, you can support 5,000. For a medium density server, 6,500. For a large server, you can support up to 15,000 users. Understand, by selecting the different VM size, you have to have the hardware that will support that size server deployment as well. So this does give a maximum number of 75,000 users on a single cluster, because you can cluster 6 expressways together. If you need capacities beyond that, you're going to have to plan accordingly. Then you got to look at availability. How important is service availability to you? Do you need to deploy redundant nodes, clusters to ensure continuous service in the event of failure? You also have to consider geography. Global distribution of users means that you may have data centers in multiple time zones. Latency may be a factor to consider when choosing where to deploy your different connector hosts. So in each deployment scenario, you need to remember that each expressway cluster has up to 6 nodes, including the primary expressway. So that's going to affect your maximum capacity limits. You must register the primary node of each expressway cluster into the Webex control hub. To connect an expressway cluster to an IM and presence service cluster, you need to enter the cluster details on the primary node of the relevant expressway cluster. And this action connects all other nodes within that expressway cluster of the IM and presence server cluster. You do not need to connect all expressway clusters to all IM and presence service clusters. That connection you make depending on the deployment model you choose. Cisco does recommend that you do not associate multiple expressway connector clusters with one IM and presence service cluster, even though your IM and presence service cluster may be able to home more message and presence users than your expressway cluster can support. You may connect IM and presence service clusters to each expressway cluster. You can support up to 5 IM and presence service clusters per expressway connector cluster. And you can use resource groups in the control hub to define your organization's geography and then assign expressway resources to different groups based on their represented locations. The set of users you assign to each resource group should correspond to the users in all of your IM and presence service clusters served by the expressways that are also within those resource groups. So those are the things to consider when you're scaling this out. This is an example of one expressway connector cluster to one IM and presence server cluster. Perfectly acceptable deployment model. This deployment option requires an expressway connector cluster per IM and presence service cluster. If you have more than one site, you can repeat this configuration in each data center. This illustration just shows 2 different locations, right? And then this option does have a low latency for interoperability, but does not address data center redundancy requirements. This is an example of one Expressway connector cluster to multiple IAM and present service clusters. Again, another acceptable deployment model. This deployment model does require one Expressway connector cluster across the whole IAM and present service deployment. And this option is simple to configure and manage, but scalability and latency could be concerns if you have a whole bunch of users across a wide geographically distributed environment. Meshing is not recommended. All right, and so what we're talking about here in this example is you have multiple Expressway deployments, but they are connected to a single IAM and present server cluster. So this example deployment may be desired if you require redundancy, but you can expect a performance impact with each message connector that you connect to the IAM and present service cluster. And so for that reason, Cisco does not recommend this solution. They recommend that you avoid connecting multiple Expressway clusters to a single IAM and present service cluster. However, if you cannot avoid meshing because data center redundancy is more important to you than latency or performance, then you should try to keep meshing to a minimum. So Cisco will support it, they just don't recommend it. So this deployment gives you the best data center redundancy. However, this option potentially has a very high performance impact. And the data centers, if the data centers are geographically dispersed over a wide area, then you could have latency problems that affect your user experience as well. So again, Cisco recommends you avoid full meshing if possible. It does work, but it's not recommended.